Achille Mauzan, who for unknown reasons would also go on to work as Lucien Achille Mauzan, was born in the town of Gap on the French Riviera in 1883, and he studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in the city of Lyon. Following graduation from his studies in 1905, at the age of 22, he moved to Turin, Italy. But whatever work he may have been creating at this time, there are no examples to be had until 1910, when a number of his largely melodramatic lithographic colour posters for various silent film productions started to appear. Whether he was working freelance or in employment, I don't know, but in 1912 the posters he had been creating in Turin led to a full-time job as an illustrator and lithographer in the graphics studio of the highly prestigious Ricordi publishing house in Milan. All the posters he created over the next 5 years were for this company, and it was with the production of these images that he effectively learned the ins and outs of the business, from the complex technical and creative demands of poster production and advertising, through to dealing with not always easy to handle clients. By no means all, but certainly quite a few of his posters at this time were also for the early Italian movie industry, and they were accordingly dramatic and representational in their execution. As with all Ricordi's published material, the posters weren't painted, but created as a series of separate elements drawn onto lithographic stones. In 1914, the Great War began, and when Italy joined the Allies against Germany, Mauzan created some stirring patriotic propaganda, including one which borrowed heavily from the original created by British illustrator Alfred Leete. There were also several others which were designed to promote the purchase of war bonds by civilians. And it was also during the years of the war that Mauzan began producing a large volume of illustrated postcards, featuring a variety of subjects, from winsome chubby children, some with fairy tale themes, and others which were demure pin-ups or couples in romantic scenarios. All these images were reproduced by full-colour offset lithography from his watercolour originals, and consequently they bore little stylistic resemblance to his poster work. But although it was the posters he was producing for Ricordi which continued to be his primary creative outlet, these postcards were also very popular in Italy for quite a few years to come. Following the end of the war, Mauzan left Ricordi to work for Giovanni Magagnoli's Maga printing and publishing company, which had bases in both Milan and Paris. It was in this period working with Maga that he appears to have been increasingly given free rein to indulge his highly creative and comedic imagination, and his more representational figure work quickly became rather scarce in his output, to be replaced in the main by sophisticated lithographic images of a considerably more humorous nature. And although the volume of imagery he created at this time for Maga was truly astonishing, he was also finding time to work as a household and decorative ceramic designer and create accomplished aquatint etchings as limited edition prints. It was in his time with Maga that Mauzan increasingly made use of single figures set against a black or dark coloured background, with the name of the product being sold most frequently occupying the lower space of the design, usually rendered in bright yellow. All of which conspired to make for a visually satisfying, eye-catching and easily understood image, always a positive in the creation of posters. Given what might be considered to be a somewhat formulaic and risk-averse approach to the design, it was the persistence of Mauzan's imagination, visual wit and affinity for occasionally grotesque characters and surreal juxtapositions that became the defining aspect of his output. But also on occasion he demonstrated an ability to produce attractive, more representational females, similar to those he was creating for his ongoing postcards. Whether he used models to create these I have no idea, but he certainly worked from his own reflection to produce the more comedic close-ups involving extreme facial expressions. And humour undoubtedly continued to be the mainstay of his Maga posters, and he used it relentlessly for any number of campaigns with considerable popular success. In particular, it was his large volume of posters featuring strange and even wildly grotesque head and shoulder portraits of a range of comical characters which came to define his output. But in 1923, following the production of a series of remarkably distinctive posters, which were eerily predictive of the kind of images created in the psychedelic 60s, Mauzan left Maga and a year later went into partnership with the businessman Achille Mauzan to launch the Mauzan agency. The business was a considerable success, and despite his role in co-managing the company, he somehow managed to remain remarkably creatively prolific. By this point he appears to have tired of his previous formulaic approach, and although he did return to it on occasion, there was certainly greater graphic variety now in evidence, and a similar more rounded approach to figure work, with occasional examples of more representational characters and more crowded comic scenarios appearing from time to time. So, for the next few years at least, Mauzan was an immensely successful business, which almost exclusively relied on his imaginative and graphic talents as the driving force behind that success. The range of clients featured was particularly broad, and ranged from well-known Italian brands through to lesser-known products, all of which benefited from the greater versatility now being seen in Mauzan's commercial images. In this phase of his career he produced a formidable torrent of posters, none of which could be accused of being pedestrian or predictable in nature, and even when creating campaigns for the same client, his creative impulse led him to markedly diverse graphic solutions. Despite the agency's considerable success, in 1927 he moved again, this time to Buenos Aires in Argentina, and following a successful introductory exhibition of his best work, the poster for which reversed his forenames, he set up his own company, Achille Mauzan, and carried on before in this new location with continued and arguably even greater popular success. The evidence of the work Mauzan was now creating from his new place of business clearly showed that he was now in considerable demand for his more humorous side, and although he continued to create all his work as traditional lithography, there were several examples of a flatter, more Art Deco graphic angularity in some of the posters he was creating. And if anything, the more surreal and memorably bizarre side of his humour was even more radical than seen in his earlier output. This headache cure is a particularly good example of this aspect of his wicked and unsettling imagination, and its popularity as an image even led to a 3D model used as point of sale in pharmacies throughout Argentina at the time. And although not as grotesque, his series of posters for the orange soda drink Bills formed a peculiar narrative of courtship, marriage and birth, involving a family of anthropomorphic orange characters. And this was most certainly a poster campaign which would be hard to forget. How big or otherwise Achille Mauzan was in terms of staffing, I have no idea, but the evidence suggests that creatively at least, Mauzan himself was the only poster artist represented, so it's more than likely he had administrative assistants to enable him to concentrate on his formidably productive output. And it's equally unlikely he would by this point have had anything other than a supervisory involvement with the reproduction of his images, otherwise his output could surely not have been so great. In 1930, Mauzan entered into a contract with the Cosmos advertising agency, the biggest and most popular of its kind in the whole of South America, and had his own department with the odd hybrid Spanish and French name Nuevos Afiches Cosmos. The many wildly entertaining and generally jubilant posters he created in Argentina in this period made him somewhat of a household name there. This isn't all that surprising when reviewing the posters he produced almost a century later. I struggle to think of anyone from any country who produced such a volume of visually engaging, stylish and memorably comical imagery in such a short time. And his partnership with Cosmos yielded some of the most enduring images for wildly successful advertising campaigns during his time in Argentina. His wife had apparently stayed in Milan during the time Mauzan had been working abroad, and in 1932 he received the terrible news that she was about to die, so he left Argentina immediately to see her for the last time. Following her death, he relocated to Paris, where he created a small number of posters, but finding the competition considerably fiercer than expected, he branched out into book illustration, with a children's book titled Gérard chez les Phoques. And although there were a few telltale Mauzan trademark devices evident in the work, many, including me, would struggle to have recognised his work, if not for the signature. The colour images were created with gestural line and bright tonal watercolour washes, and they obviously highlighted the more slapstick elements of the story. And there were others reproduced in black only, but it was a rare and engaging deviation from what had been his main occupation. In the later 1930s he returned to his birthplace, Gap, and supposedly retired from commercial work to spend his time as an artist. I could only find a couple of examples of his paintings, but they did include this fascinating bacchanalian image of centaurs, and there were some comical clay sculptures from this time too. I did find just 2 more posters, this amusing image of a tiger rug coming to life from 1939, and a far from typical 1941 wartime Christmas message of hope for war-torn France. And although I can't date the work accurately, he also created some particularly absorbing sepia-tinted, tonally rendered monochromes for an edition of the story of Cartouche the Brigand by Paul Rabou, which for reasons I've been unable to discover was never actually published. And on this amusing and expressive evidence, that was a great pity. Seemingly out of nowhere in 1945 he published the book The Hallucinatory Powers of Rupert Saint-Georges, which he also wrote. It contained chapter headings in pen and ink, and many surreal page illustrations which, as far as I can tell, were rendered in ink and pastel or maybe graphite, to create tonal shading and round out the characters. I have no idea what the actual written narrative was, but the comical and frequently bizarre images strongly suggest it was a far from everyday story. The illustrations were only created and printed in half-tone monochrome, and in colour they would undoubtedly have had broader appeal and greater definition. But nevertheless, this collection of unusual illustrations constituted a remarkable, atypical and completely engrossing body of images which were a fitting and distinctive creative epitaph for this immensely talented man. And Achille Mauzan died in Gap in 1952 at the age of 69. In his lifetime, Mauzan created somewhere in the region of 2,500 posters, more than 1,000 postcards, and a small but impressive amount of bookwork and paintings and sculptures. More than most, he seems to have been a man very much in charge of his own destiny, who fully utilised his skills, not only as a highly creative image maker, but also as an astute businessman, with an impressive list of significant clients across 2 continents and 3 different countries. Apparently he is still fairly well known and admired in Argentina, but unfortunately neither France nor Italy seem to be all that bothered about keeping his memory alive. But whether you previously knew of his existence or not, I hope you'll agree with me that his work constitutes some of the most entertaining, memorable and graphically considered commercial illustration of the last 100 years.